Quick heads up before we start, there's a full spoiler warning for both Vinland Saga and Berserk in this video. If you haven't watched either of the shows, just watch them and come back. So we have the two main characters, Thorfinn, who just wanted to make his dad proud in the beginning, but then basically turned into a weapon that forgot that he is human himself. And then we've got Guts, who just wanted to belong somewhere, have people around him who love him, but in the end turned out to be alone and covered in scars from his journey. And both these characters start out thinking strength is the answer to anything. Both of them get exactly what they thought they wanted, and both of them find out in completely different ways that getting what you wanted doesn't mean anything if you build it on the wrong foundation. So I actually want to sit with these two for a minute and not just skim their arcs, but like really dig into what they went through and what it actually means to be a man, and how these stories teach us what it means to be a man. So yeah, this will take a minute or two. Hope you enjoy. Let's actually start at the root of both of these characters, because I don't think you'll understand where they end up if you don't understand what broke them first. Thorfinn's whole worldview gets built around one person, his father, Thor's the legendary Troll of Yom. And Thor's is the strongest warrior in the story, but what is actually important about him, Thor's doesn't want to fight anyone. He faked his own death years earlier specifically to get out of that life and protect his family. So young Thorfinn grows up right at the intersection of two contradictory lessons. My dad is the strongest man alive, and my dad hates fighting. He doesn't understand yet that those two things aren't actually in conflict. And then Askeladd, the main antagonist in the first season's crew, catches up to them, and Thor sacrifices himself in a duel to buy his men and his son time to escape, dying in front of his son in a fight he never wanted. And afterwards, Thorfinn doesn't walk away from that thinking, yeah, violence is complicated. He walks away thinking, if I'd been stronger, this would have never happened. And that's the seed of everything that follows in the story. So he spends years growing up as Askeladd's captive and then his crewmate, chasing one goal: get strong enough to duel and kill the man who killed his father. And the story lets you buy into it. You watch him train, get better, earn small wins. You really think that, yeah, Thorfinn is like kinda cool when he's fighting, so you root for him. And then Thorfinn finally gets his shot at the duel against Askeladd he spent years chasing, and he loses. Askeladd, still the far more experienced fighter, beats him decisively and spares his life, instead of finishing him off. So Thorfinn doesn't get the revenge his entire identity was built around. And later on, Prince Canute, awakening in that moment into the ruthless king he's about to become, kills Askeladd himself for reasons that have nothing to do with Thorfinn at all. Thorfinn doesn't get satisfaction, he doesn't get the revenge he wanted, he just gets nothing. The one goal his whole life was built around was taken away by someone else entirely. What he becomes afterwards for years is a hollow, half-starved slave laborer who's given up on talking, given up on fighting, given up on everything basically. A guy who can still fight better than almost anyone alive and has no idea what any of it was for anymore, because the single thing he wanted is something he couldn't have. Guts' version of this is structured differently, but it hits the same nerve. Raised by the mercenary Gambino effectively as a weapon from early childhood, forced to kill for the first time as a kid just to survive. Strength for Guts was never a choice, it was survival from the first day on. And for a long stretch, that strength does work. It gets him into the Band of the Hawk under the leadership of Griffith, which becomes the first thing that ever looks like belonging to Guts. But even at the height of the Golden Age arc, where the group is winning battles, they earn respect, and it finally looks like a family to Guts, the strength alone isn't what's holding the band together, it's Griffith's ambition. And Guts is essentially as a sword, not yet as a person with his own directions and ambitions. That's why eventually he decides to leave the Band of the Hawk to go find his own path. And that decision, choosing himself over Griffith for the first time, is what breaks something in Griffith that never fully heals. And then comes the eclipse. Griffith, captured and broken after Guts leaves, ends up offering the entire Band of the Hawk as a human sacrifice to become one of the God Hand, transforming into the demon Femto. Nearly everyone Guts fought alongside for years is slaughtered in front of him. Guts does survive, but pinned down he has to helplessly watch as Griffith assaults Casca, the woman he loves, and on top of that he loses an eye and his arm in the same night. All that strength, the exact thing he built his entire identity around, wasn't enough to save a single person that mattered to him. So both of Thorfinn and Guts get taught the same brutal lesson from two completely different angles. Strength is a tool, it's not a personality, and it's definitely not a purpose. You can max it out completely and still lose everything that actually mattered. That's the first thing either of these stories is trying to tell you. And here's where both stories become interesting for this video. After Askeladd's death and years as a broken slave, Thorfinn ends up bought by Ketil, a farmer, and slowly starts coming back to life through labor instead of violence. He doesn't become soft. He's still without a question one of the most physically dangerous people in every room he walks into, and that's proven later when he has to fight again. He just stops making violence the point of his existence. He then becomes close with Einar, a fellow slave, and the two of them end up protecting each other, and eventually a whole community of people with nothing. Former slaves, refugees, people who have no ability to protect themselves, not because someone's forcing him to, because he's finally aimed the strength somewhere other than his own wounds. Strength that used to exist purely to solve Thorfinn's aim for revenge gets redirected towards solving other people's pain instead. Nothing about his capability changed, only the direction changed. And Guts goes through something similar, angrier and more reluctant. After the eclipse, he spends a long stretch as the Black Swordsman, driven by vengeance, hunting down the apostles, one by one, using his massive Dragon Slayer sword and a mechanical arm built to replace the one that he has lost. For Guts, the turn comes when he finds Casca again at the end of the Tower of Conviction arc. She's alive, but her mind is essentially reset to zero just when he left her, so he makes the decision to prioritize protecting her over continuing his revenge against Griffith. That's the pivot, the exact same strength, redirected from the make them pay to keep her safe. And the found family builds around him. Slowly, whether he wants it or not. Isidro, a kid who idolizes him, Fornes, Serpico, and the little witch Shirka. They choose to travel with him, despite how closed off he is. He barely talks about his feelings, but watch what he's willing to fight for, watch him put himself in dangers for the sake of the others. That's where the actual answer is of what he is using his strength for now. So I think the modern conversation about masculinity tends to collapse into two options. Never show emotion, or process everything out loud. So now I wanted to talk about how both of these characters take accountability for what they've done, and on how they will improve. So Thorfinn spends years actually sitting with the fact that during his time with Askeladd's band, he wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He participated in raids, in killings, in exactly the kind of violence that had taken his own father from him. The story doesn't let him off easy just because his motivations were understandable. He was, for a long stretch, functionally just as bad as Askeladd. And here's the most important detail in the entire format. He doesn't handle that by deciding to feel sorry for himself. He commits to non-violence entirely, refuses to fight even when attacked, and eventually sets his sights on an almost impossible goal, sailing to Vinland, a real distant land, to build a settlement free of slavery and the constant tribal warfare that defined his entire childhood. This ambition speaks real volumes, as a guy who did real damage trying to rebuild something to counteract his deeds in the past truly sets an example. Guts carries something similar. Though a lot of what happened to him was done to him rather than done by himself, he still carries real guilt about leaving the Band of the Hawk when he did, about not being able to stop what happened to Casca, and later on about leaving Casca to herself to follow his path of revenge. Critically, he doesn't spiral into self-pity about it. He doesn't run from what happened. He also doesn't let it become an excuse to stop moving forward. He keeps walking, carrying the guilt, and using it as fuel instead of letting it burn him. This is why I think that these two characters are primary examples to what real accountability looks like. It's not comfortable and it's not quick. It doesn't happen in a moment. It's a sustained, ongoing decision to keep building something better in full view of what you already broke. Okay, this is the part I think people misread the most, in both of these stories and also in real life. So at a certain point, Thorfinn straight up decides he's done with violence as a matter of principle. When he's later confronted by armed men, including agents connected to Canute, who's now king and has his own complicated history with Thorfinn, he refuses to draw a weapon, even at serious risk to himself. That's not fear, because it takes considerably more strength for him at that point in the story to walk away from a fight he could win easily. Because choosing not to fight when you're completely capable of winning isn't cowardice. It's the harder and braver option by a wide margin. Cowardice was never really about whether or not you throw a punch. It's about whether you're willing to face things honestly, even when facing them is hard. A guy who avoids a fight because he thinks violence doesn't achieve anything isn't a coward, but a guy who avoids responsibility, avoids being honest about who he actually is because it's uncomfortable, even if he's never lost a fight in his life. And Guts almost never stops fighting physically. He's still hunting apostles, still facing down monstrous enemies, and still wields his enormous sword. On the surface, that might make him look like the old school version of himself, where strength's the only thing that matters to him. But the thing that makes him honorable isn't the fighting itself, is that he never quits on Casca, even when caring for her costs him almost everything else he might want for himself, including any real chance at revenge against Griffith, who by then is leading his own kingdom as the White Falcon and has become nearly untouchable. That's the actual courage being tested underneath all the action in both these stories. Not the will you throw the first punch, but rather will you still show up when everything in you is exhausted and you want to give up? Will you stay honest when a lie would be so much easier? Will you keep carrying the people counting on you long after it stopped being exciting to do it? That's honor, once you strip away the aesthetic of swords and battles both stories are wrapped in. It was never about not backing down from a fight, it's about never backing down from what truly matters and from what you actually owe the people around you. And I just want to spend a second on something I think the most important structural detail in both stories is. Neither of the two protagonists start out as someone worth looking up to. For a huge proportion of Vinland Saga, Thorfinn is functionally just a killer serving under the man who murdered his father, chasing revenge above anything else. So if the story had ended at Askeladd's death, Thorfinn wouldn't have been remembered as a good character, but more of like just a villain story. And Guts also spends a long part of his story as pure rage, guided by only his rage and his hatred. So if Guts wouldn't have decided to come back for Casca, the whole of Berserk would just be about hatred and vengeance. And this is exactly why I specifically chose these two instead of a more traditional hero to represent masculinity. A character who's just naturally noble from the beginning doesn't teach you anything about how to actually become something better. That's why these two are perfect examples, because their journey was full of ups and downs and it didn't turn out right from the very start. And so the story teaches us what it actually takes to build something worth respecting. Nobody's born as the version of themselves worth looking up to. It's not a finish line you cross once. It's something you build, piece by piece, usually to exactly the kind of stuff that nearly breaks you along the way. The same way both of these guys did. So here's where I actually land with all this after going through both the stories of Vinland Saga and Berserk. Being a real man was never strength for its own sake, and it was never the total absence of feeling anything either. It's strength that's been deliberately pointed somewhere good instead of somewhere selfish. It's caring about people with real intensity without needing to announce it every 5 minutes. It's actually facing what you've done wrong, all the way through instead of quietly moving past it. And it's having the actual guts to be honest, especially when honest is clearly the harder option. Neither Guts nor Thorfinn started out as someone you'd want to be. That's not an accident, it's the entire point. They had to build the version of themselves worth respecting, slowly, usually through the exact experiences that were hardest to them. Thorfinn through years as a slave and the killer before he even touched Vinland's soil. Guts through the single worst night of his life before he ever chose Casca over revenge. So, if you're going to take one thing from this video, take this. Figure out where your strength is actually pointed to. Toward yourself or toward the people around you. That's basically the entire test both of these characters had to pass. And it's just the same for us in real life.